The night Brian Thorne crushed his wine glass with his bare hand, I was the one who handed him a fresh napkin. I said nothing. I had been saying nothing for 5 years. I watched him humiliate his wife at dinner tables, in boardrooms, in front of colleagues who all looked the other way, including me. But tonight was different. Because the woman who walked through those restaurant doors glowing, laughing, wearing emerald silk and sapphires, her arm linked through the arm of the most powerful man in the room, that woman was Emma. The same Emma he handed a divorce envelope to right at my table. The same Emma who walked out into the rain without making a single scene. She was back, and she was not alone. She was not broken. She was not small. She was everything he had thrown away, and she was standing 3 feet from his table. What happened next silenced an entire dining room. It shut down a billion-dollar company. It ended a man who thought money made him untouchable. And it started with one question Brian never expected to have to ask standing in the middle of a charity gala, begging the woman he discarded, "Is it mine?" Her answer destroyed him. Not with anger. Not with a lawsuit, though that came too. With something far more lethal. A smile. A slow, deliberate, ice-cold smile. Stay with me. Because this story is proof that the person you thought you buried was never in the ground. They were building their throne underneath you. The most dangerous person in the room is never the loudest one. It is the quiet one you underestimated. If that hit you somewhere deep, you are not alone. Drop a comment below with the word Queen and tell me what justice moment gave you chills. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe because every week I bring you stories where the truth always wins.
It is about seeing that the person you thought you destroyed has instead built an empire from the ashes you left behind. I always hated the rumor Brian spread about our chandeliers being diamonds. It was gaudy, just like him. At Lorraine, we sell elegance, not fabrications. Tonight, he was holding court at the royal table, the one he always demanded, with a girl who looked like she was assembled, not born. She was more interested in her phone than in the man who had just conquered a business rival. He had everything he thought he wanted, but his eyes were empty. I saw it from my post at the door. I saw it all. "Put your phone away," he told her, his voice a low growl. There was no joy in his command, just irritation. "We're celebrating," he reminded her. "The merger is done. I own it all now." The girl looked up, her expression a perfect blank. "Oh, that's great, honey. Does this mean we can get that place in Como? The one with the private marina?" I watched him swirl his wine, the boredom radiating from him like a cold front. It was a hollowness I had seen growing in him for months, ever since Emma was gone. The name itself felt like a memory from a different, better man. She was the one who believed in him when he was nothing. The one whose quiet strength was the foundation he built his entire empire on. I remember her reading his proposals by the dim light of the bar, her brow furrowed in concentration while he charmed investors. As his wealth grew, however, his patience for her simplicity vanished. He saw her as a relic of a past he wanted to erase. I always told myself his cruelty wasn't my business, but I saw the look on her face the last night they came here together. He handed her an envelope right at the table. She didn't make a scene. She just looked at him with a sorrow so profound it silenced the air around them. I'll never forget her whisper as she left, "You'll regret this, Brian," before she walked out alone into the rain, leaving him there with the check. "Brian, you're not even listening," the girl whined, clinking her fork against her glass. "I need another drink, and our waiter is ghosting me." "He's not ghosting you. He's busy," Brian snapped, his composure finally cracking. Just then, a hush fell over the dining room. It wasn't a gradual thing. It was a sudden, collective intake of breath. At my podium, I was the first to see why. A guest arriving at Lorraine is common. An icon arriving is an event. But this was something else entirely. "Who is that?" the girl asked, craning her neck. "Is that someone famous?" Brian half turned, his annoyance shifting to curiosity, just in time to see me step forward to greet them. I straightened my tie, my professional calm, a mask for my own awe. 4 security men, discreet and formidable, parted the way for the couple. The man was Adrian Vance, tall, silver-haired, radiating a kind of power that made Brian Thorne's look like cheap theater. Vance didn't demand respect. He simply commanded it by existing. His suit probably cost more than my car. Everyone who mattered knew who he was, the apex predator of our world. He controlled global shipping, satellites, the very banks that funded men like Brian. He was old money, a force of nature. But the sight of Adrian Vance wasn't what made Brian's face drain of all its color. It was the woman on his arm. I almost didn't recognize her. She wore an emerald silk gown that shimmered under the crystal lights, her hair falling in waves down her back. A sapphire necklace glittered at her throat. It was Emma, but reborn. The quiet, almost invisible woman I remembered was gone. This woman moved with a regal confidence that owned the entire room. And then I saw the gentle curve of her stomach, impossible to miss. She was months along, radiant with it. From across the room, I heard the sharp crack of glass as Brian's hand crushed the stem of his wine goblet. The red wine bled across the white linen, a stain as shocking as the look on his face. "Oh my God, what did you do?" the girl shrieked, jumping back. Brian didn't seem to notice. All I could see was the utter devastation in his eyes. Pregnant, she had to be well into her 2nd trimester. I watched him do the math in his head. The confusion, the rage, the dawning horror. The world he had built for himself was tilting on its axis. Was it his, or had she moved on with a speed and finality that was, in itself, a brutal revenge? I began to lead them to their table, our path set to take us directly past his. Emma's eyes found his as we approached. I held my breath, expecting her to falter, to look away. She didn't. There was no pain in her gaze, no lingering affection. There was only the calm, dismissive indifference you'd give a piece of furniture. Adrian Vance placed a hand on her back, a gesture of pure protection, and murmured something that made her laugh. It was a clear, happy sound that seemed to echo in the silent room. We moved past them, a quiet storm leaving a trail of jasmine and utter destruction. "Wait," Chloe whispered, her eyes wide. "Isn't that your ex? The boring one?" Brian just stared at the spreading red stain. "Yes," he choked out. "That's Emma." One of my waiters rushed to his table, apologizing for the mess that wasn't his fault. Brian waved him away, his face a mask of fury. "I don't get it," the girl said, her voice piercing the tension. "You said she had nothing. How is she with Adrian Vance? My father says he could buy this whole city." "I don't know," Brian snarled, loud enough to make heads turn. His hands were clenched under the table. "I don't know." I seated Adrian and Emma at the private alcove, the one with the view of the skyline that Brian could never secure. It offered them a perfect sanctuary from prying eyes. From my post, I could see it all. I watched Adrian hold her chair, the way the staff treated her like a queen. What struck me most was how he looked at her, not as a possession, but with a deep, reverent love. His hand rested gently on her pregnant belly, a simple act that screamed protection, ownership, and joy. It must be mine, I imagined Brian thinking. She never told me. I saw the possessive firelight in his eyes, the arrogance returning. That was his child, his legacy. He stood up abruptly. "I'm going to the restroom." But I knew he wasn't. As he started toward their table, I took 2 steps forward, blocking his path. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thorne," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I can't let you disturb our guests." I remember the first time I saw him cut her down. It was a company picnic 5 years ago. She'd suggested a simple fix for a server issue, and he laughed, telling her to stick to planning parties. I stood there, holding my paper plate, and said nothing. Tonight, watching him rise from his table at the Vesper, that same cold dread twisted in my gut. He wasn't heading for the men's room. He was on a warpath, straight for the corner booth where she sat. His face was a thundercloud of rage and something else, a wild desperation I'd never seen before. Two mountains in suits stepped out to stop him, and I watched him try to pull rank. It didn't work. Not until a calm voice I didn't recognize gave the order to let him pass. He stepped toward her, and she didn't even bother to look up. Even from across the dining room, I could see she was glowing. Motherhood looked magnificent on her, a peaceful radiance that shamed my memory of the withdrawn woman from the picnic. He said her name, his voice tight with strain. I saw her slowly lower the menu, her eyes meeting his with a chilling calm. "Hello, Brian," she said, her voice carrying in the hushed room. "I wondered when you'd finally make your way over." I saw his eyes drop, his jaw clench. He said something blunt. It had to be about the baby. She replied with a cool smile, and I saw his gaze flick to the man beside her, Adrian Vance, who was watching my boss with the amusement of a lion watching a mouse. Then his eyes went back to her belly. "Is it mine?" The words were unspoken from my distance, but his posture screamed them. Her laugh was short, sharp, and utterly devastating. She shook her head, a small, sad gesture. I remembered the night he'd kicked her out. The office gossip had been vicious, all of it siding with him. "You lack vision," he'd apparently said. Now, watching him posture and claim rights, I felt sick. He took a step closer, his voice a low growl. That's when Adrian Vance spoke. He didn't shout, he didn't even stand. But the authority in his voice was absolute. It stopped Brian cold, a puppet with its strings suddenly cut. Mr. Vance swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his movements slow and deliberate. "It seems you're confused about a few things," he said, his voice a low hum of power that I could feel even from my table. "First, you will not speak to my fiancé that way. It's not good for the baby." Fiancé. The word hit our side of the room like a shockwave. Adrian Vance continued, his eyes like ice chips. He spoke of Brian's affair with some model, his complete neglect of his own wife. The words were a quiet indictment, dismantling Brian's entire charade of the wronged husband. I watched Brian's face burn with a humiliation he'd never known. He turned to Emma, a desperate plea in his eyes. "Tell him," he begged, his voice cracking. "Tell him what we were." I'll never forget her reply. She just rested a hand on her stomach. "I already did," she said softly. "I told him you were the kind of man who needed me to be small so you could feel big." She reached for Adrian's hand. Then Adrian showed me I was priceless. The venom returned to Brian's face. "It's the money," he spat, his last shred of dignity gone. "A millionaire for a billionaire. You're just a gold digger." The air in the room became frigid. I watched Adrian set his glass down, the sound echoing in the silence. His voice was dangerously low. "Be careful," he warned. "You're speaking to the chairwoman of the Vance Foundation." He explained she was nothing like Brian, that she had rebuilt her life from the ruins he'd left it in. Just then, Chloe the model clattered over, her heels loud on the marble. She was completely oblivious, wrapping herself around Brian's arm. "What's the holdup?" she whined, then her gaze fell on Emma. A nasty smirk spread across her face. "Oh, it's you. Wow. Divorce really did a number on you, huh?" For a moment, no one breathed. But Emma just smiled, a look of profound pity on her face. "And you must be Chloe. Brian always did, like, shiny things with no substance. Chloe gasped, speechless. You can have him, Emma said, already turning back to her menu as if dismissing a fly. He's used goods, but a word of advice? Read the prenup. He guards his money more than anything. Adrian let out a low, satisfied laugh. Marcus, please remove them. They're ruining the ambiance. The bodyguard moved, a human wall blocking Brian's path. This isn't over, Emma, Brian snarled as he was led away, a pathetic, empty threat. I'll see you in court. You can't keep my child from me. That's when Adrian finally stood. He was taller than Brian, an imposing figure of quiet menace. He leaned in, his voice a lethal whisper I couldn't hear but whose effect was obvious. If you so much as look at her again, he promised, I won't just sue you. I'll buy your company and dismantle it for parts, leaving you with nothing. Brian stumbled back, defeated. He returned to his table, a hollow man, and stared at the empty chair across from him. I watched as Emma laughed at something Adrian said, her hand resting on a future that could have been his. It was the first time I had ever seen Brian Thorne look completely and utterly powerless. The night was almost over. I was trying to leave when I saw another man in a suit approaching their table, a process server. My first thought was that Adrian Vance was in some kind of trouble, but the man walked past the billionaire and stopped directly at my boss's table. Brian Thorne? He asked. Yes. The man placed a thick envelope on the table next to a wine stain. You've been served. I watched, frozen, as Brian ripped it open. His hands were shaking. The lawsuit wasn't from Adrian. It was from her. The plaintiff was Emma Vance Cross, and the subject was the theft of intellectual property. The Thorne algorithmic model. The foundation of everything. All the color vanished from Brian's face. The algorithm. His billion-dollar baby. The code he'd always claimed as his own masterpiece. I remembered the origin story he'd tell at company meetings, a tale of solo genius. It was all a lie. She wasn't just back for payback. She was here to reclaim her throne. The next morning, the office felt like a tomb. I walked past the main conference room and saw Brian inside, his head buried in his hands. His top lawyer, a man who usually oozed confidence, looked terrified. I overheard Brian's desperate voice through the glass. You're joking. She was a literature major. She proofread my emails, he pleaded. I saw the lawyer, Sterling, take off his glasses, his expression grave. I lingered by the coffee machine, pretending to fill my cup, listening. Our tech team analyzed the source code, Sterling said. The one everything is built on. They found something buried in the kernel. Hidden metadata. I heard Brian's impatient demand. Then, on the large screen inside the room, an image flashed. It was a dense wall of code, but highlighted within it were several lines of notes, and a signature, for Brian, so you can finally get some sleep tonight. Love, E. My blood ran cold. I suddenly remembered seeing her through their apartment window years ago, surrounded by textbooks on C++, while Brian was out celebrating some minor victory. I saw him slump against the glass as the memory seemed to hit him, too. He'd been on the verge of failing a class, his project a total disaster. He'd told us he pulled an all-nighter and had a stroke of genius. The truth was so much worse. Emma hadn't just fixed a typo. She had built his entire future from scratch while he slept. Sterling's voice was grim. It gets worse. The legal filings show she copyrighted this exact code under the name Ghostwriter 3 days before your company ever launched. She owns it all, Brian, and she's filing an injunction to shut down the servers immediately. Brian bellowed, shoving his chair back. Shut us down? A day offline and our stock will tank. A week and we're finished. Then you make a deal, Sterling urged. Give her whatever she wants. Cash, stock, a public apology, With her proof and Adrian Vance's legal team, they'll bury us. Brian stumbled to the window, staring down at the city he thought he owned. His phone buzzed, and I saw a text light up the screen. It was Chloe. Something about a declined credit card at Gucci. With a roar of pure rage, Brian threw the phone against the wall, where it exploded into 100 pieces. He couldn't lose. He was Brian Thorne, the visionary, not a fraud who stole his wife's brilliance. In that moment, I made a choice. I went back to my desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out an old hard drive from my first year at the company. On it were project drafts from before we were Thorne Tech, drafts with her initials all over the code annotations. I slipped it into an anonymous envelope, addressed it to her new legal team, and dropped it in the mail. It was a small act, but after years of silence, it felt like everything. I remember the day he decided to go after her. Brian turned to Sterling, his face a mask of desperate confidence, asking where she was. "The Silver Gala," Sterling said, "a $20,000 a plate charity thing." "Get me a ticket," Brian ordered, that familiar steel in his voice. I stood there, by the conference room door, pretending to sort files. He ignored Sterling's warning about the restraining order, shouting about how he just needed to remind her of what they had. He was convinced she was just sentimental, that he could talk his way back in. I knew better. I'd seen the way he looked at her when he thought no one was watching, not with love, but with the cold calculation of an owner assessing his property. Sterling, ever the loyal dog, pulled out his phone, but even he sounded doubtful. And me? I just stayed quiet, like I always did. The museum was a sea of shimmering silver, a world away from our stuffy office. I felt out of place, a ghost watching the city's elite drift by. My ticket had cost me a month's rent, a penance for my silence. Brian was there alone, playing the part of the grieving husband in his best suit. I watched him from across the hall, a fraud swimming in a tank of sharks who smelled his blood in the water. Every whisper I passed seemed to be about him, about Thorntech's freefall and Vance Global's rise. He was scanning the crowd, looking for her emerald dress, his favorite color on her. But Emma wasn't wearing his color tonight. She was on a stage, a vision in liquid silver, a maternity dress that made her look like a goddess. She was reborn. "A $50 million donation," Emma's voice rang out, clear and strong, "for legal aid to women treated unfairly in their divorces." The room exploded with applause. I saw Brian flinch like he'd been shot. That fund wasn't charity. It was a declaration of war, aimed directly at him. As she descended from the stage, swallowed by a crowd of admirers, Brian made his move. He pushed through people who now looked at him with open contempt. I held my breath. "Emma!" he called out. The crowd parted around them like the sea, creating a stage for the final act everyone had been waiting for. She stopped, and for a moment I saw the woman who used to bring donuts for the whole team on Fridays. Then she turned, and that woman was gone. Adrian wasn't by her side for once. A senator had him cornered near the bar. This was the opening Brian thought he needed. "Brian," she said, her voice smooth as ice, "how thoughtful of you to buy a ticket. We'll just count that $20,000 as a small deposit on your overdue alimony." A few people close by snickered. He moved closer, his voice a low, urgent hiss I could barely hear, begging to speak privately. I didn't need to hear her reply. Her posture said it all. "This is about the company," he pleaded, desperation cracking his voice. "You're destroying it. Think of the employees." He was trying to play on her good nature, the one he had spent years extinguishing. "You're a good person," he said, and I almost choked on my drink. "The kind of woman who rescues stray cats." I saw her eyes flash with a fire I'd never seen before. Her voice, though low, carried across the sudden hush. The woman who rescued stray cats died the night she slept in her car because her husband canceled all her credit cards. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Brian's face went pale. That was a detail none of us knew. "My code is the foundation of that company," she said, stepping toward him, her voice a deadly whisper. "My mind built it. You were just the handsome face, Brian, and now the mask is coming off." I felt a shiver of vindication, tainted with the shame of my own inaction. He reached for her then, grabbing her arm. "What about our child?" he pleaded, his last desperate gamble. "He needs me." I watched her look down at his hand on her arm, then back to his eyes. A slow, chilling smile spread across her face, completely devoid of warmth. It was the smile of a queen about to pass sentence. "You really want to talk about the baby, Brian?" she asked. "Yes," he breathed, thinking he'd finally found a crack in her armor. "It's my right." From my vantage point, I saw her take a deep breath, preparing to deliver the killing blow. "All right," she said, her voice rising to command the attention of everyone nearby. "The night you threw me out, I was holding a small white box. Do you remember?" I saw the confusion on his face, then the flicker of memory. "I remember," he whispered. "That box," her voice trembled with controlled fury, "held a positive pregnancy test and a pair of infant shoes. I was trying to tell you we were going to be parents. You called it garbage and told me to get out." The world seemed to stop. The color drained from Brian's face. "So don't you dare," she seethed. "Pretend you care about being a father. You have a real father now, a man who held me while I cried." Before Brian could even process it, a hand landed on his shoulder. Adrian Vance moved through the crowd with a quiet deadliness. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice calm but heavy with menace. Brian tried to shrug off the hand, but it was like trying to move a statue. "She's not your wife," Brian spat, pure jealousy twisting his features. Adrian just smiled. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper, tucking it neatly into Brian's breast pocket. "A little light reading for your trip home," he said. "It's a copy of the adoption agreement." "I legally adopted our child 2 weeks ago, in utero," Adrian stated calmly. "The court cited proven abandonment by the biological source." Brian just stood there, speechless. "You can't do that," he stammered. "I'm Adrian Vance," he replied simply. "Now get out of my sight." Utterly defeated, Brian fled, the weight of 100 pairs of eyes burning into his back. He stumbled out into the night, a king dethroned in his own city. As he disappeared, I saw him pull the document from his pocket. I knew this wasn't over, but the war had been won. His face was a mask of disbelief under the streetlights. I saw it all from the museum steps. He reread the paper, his eyes scanning frantically. That's when I knew what Adrian had given him. It wasn't just adoption papers. I remembered it then, a ghost from an old server migration project years ago. A stray medical file, sealed, from when Brian was a teenager. Curiosity had gotten the better of me. I opened it. Congenital defect. 0% chance. In that moment, watching him crumble, the knowledge I had kept buried for years felt like a physical weight. He had never been the father. He could never have been anyone's father. The next day, the office was a morgue. The news of Brian demanding a new test at a fertility clinic was all over the gossip sites. They said the doctor just pulled his old records, the same ones I had seen. For 5 years, I had watched him chip away at Emma's confidence, month after month. The sighs of disappointment, the comments about her age, the endless doctor's visits he forced on her, all of it, a lie to cover his own brokenness. I sat at my desk, the silence in the office deafening, but the noise in my head was a scream of complicity. I had known. My hands were trembling as I navigated to the old, archived server on my computer. I hadn't been aware he was destroying her. Not really. I had just chosen to look away. No more. I found the encrypted file, the proof of his lifelong lie. He had promised Chloe an heir, an empire, a promise built on nothing. I opened a secure, anonymous email client. It was time for the truth to have a voice other than mine. I attached the file and sent it to Emma's lead attorney. The subject line was simple. He always knew. My finger hovered over the send button. Then I clicked. It was a small act in a big war, but for the first time in 5 years, my silence was broken. I remember the first day I saw her, Chloe. It was the same week Emma stopped coming into the office. The air just shifted. Suddenly our workspace was littered with designer bags, leftovers from shopping sprees that cost more than my salary. I was fixing a bug near Brian's office when I first heard her, yelling into her phone about a rejected credit card. When Brian walked in, soaked from a storm, she didn't even seem to notice. All she saw was a problem to be fixed. I saw him look at her, then really look. And for a second, I thought he finally saw the hollowness I saw every day. The shouting started not long after. We all heard it, even with our headphones on. Her laugh was like glass shattering. I heard a thud, like something being kicked across the room. We all knew who he was talking about when he mentioned his ex-wife, the one who was worth 10 times more. Emma was the soul of this company. She built the code we all worked on. Chloe just consumed. I stayed glued to my chair, my fists clenched, a silent coward as the woman who co-founded our world was being erased. When she slammed the door, the vibration felt final. Her words, "a bank account on legs," hung in the air. The truth is, we all knew the company was teetering on the edge. I saw Brian standing alone in his glass-walled office, a silhouette against the city lights. The grief I'd seen in his eyes earlier had curdled into something ugly and cold. A quiet rage began to fill that room, a pressure I could feel even from my desk. I thought it was just the stress of the business failing. I had no idea he was aiming that rage at Emma. He became a ghost after that, pacing his office, his voice a low murmur on the phone. I didn't know who he was talking to, but I saw the calculated coldness in his eyes. He was building a weapon. The rumors about Emma being pregnant had been floating around, but the idea she'd been unfaithful felt so wrong. It wasn't the Emma we knew, the one who'd bring us coffee during late-night coding sessions. I was just an employee, though. I told myself it wasn't my place. I kept my head down, wrote my code, and let the silence make me a liar too. The next morning, the headline was a punch to the gut. The story painted Brian as a victim, a loving husband betrayed. It twisted Emma into a gold digger. It made me physically ill. I watched our boss, Marcus Sterling, run into Brian's office, his face pale. Brian just smiled, confident that his money and power could bend reality itself. He thought he was winning a corporate battle, but I knew, watching him, that he was burning down his own life, and I was just one of the employees watching the fire spread. "You have to look at this," Marcus said, and the whole floor turned to the giant monitor we used for presentations. Vance Global was holding a live press conference. My heart hammered against my ribs when Adrian Vance took the podium, looking completely unfazed. Then Emma stepped into the frame. She wasn't hiding in shame. She looked directly into the camera, her eyes filled with a strength that shamed my silence. In that instant, I was rooting for her, hoping she would burn it all to the ground. When she spoke, the entire office went dead silent. The story of the IVF, of wanting to surprise the husband she loved with a child. It was heartbreaking. She held up the medical document, dated from before the divorce. I remembered how tired she looked back then, how we all just assumed it was work stress. The thought of her going through that alone, only to be thrown out while pregnant with the child he supposedly wanted, it was monstrous. My complicity in doing nothing felt like a stain I could never wash off. We all held our breath, listening to her story. Her one tear felt like it landed in our office. When she said, "He simply picked up the treasure that you were too blind to see," it was a final judgment. Then Adrian Vance stepped back up and mentioned the ghostwriter software. My blood ran cold. He was talking about Emma's original code, the code that I, on Brian's orders, had been tasked to alter that very morning, trying to hide her digital fingerprints. A failsafe, Adrian said. A kill switch. My hands started to tremble. The file migration I had initiated wasn't a migration at all. I was the one who had just armed the bomb. As he counted down from 3, I watched the server lights on the other side of the room flicker one by one. The constant, comforting hum of the machines died. My screen went black. Everything I had worked on, everything Emma had built, was gone because I followed orders. The assistant's scream shattered the silence. The platform, the app, everything was offline. On the screen, Adrian's final word, checkmate, was met with the rising panic in our office. But I just stared at the blinking cursor on my dead monitor. I watched Brian stand there, a statue in the ruins, his phone buzzing with calls from a world that no longer recognized him as king. He had lost, and I had helped. He stood at the window, looking down at the city that had once been his. I could see the street far below, saw a black SUV pull up. I saw Emma helped into the car by a tall, gentle man. She was safe. She had won. Then I saw Brian just crumble. He pulled out an old, worn photo. I'd seen it on his desk in the early days, back when he and Emma were a team. I knew in that moment, as his whole world imploded, he finally understood that he'd traded a queen for a castle made of sand. The next 3 years were a slow, public autopsy of his life. I stayed on for a few months with the liquidation team, watching them tag his possessions like evidence at a crime scene. The SEC questioned me for 18 months. I kept my head down, afraid. But on my final interview, I couldn't take it anymore. I walked out, then turned back. I pulled a thumb drive from my keychain. "You should see this," I told the agent. "It's a backup of the original source code with all of Emma's embedded author notes. It was a small act, but it was the truth. It was my penance." I remember the first time I saw them break him. It was a Tuesday, colder than it had any right to be, and this man they called Jules was staring into space. He looked like a ghost in that cheap company windbreaker, completely lost. That's when I knew this job was more than just parking cars for him. It was some kind of punishment. And for 3 years, I just watched. I saw the way he'd flinch when Manny, our 20-year-old Napoleon of a boss, yelled at him. Tonight, the wind off the lake was a monster, but Jules just stood there, taking the hits from the cold like he took them from everyone else. I was huddled by the door when Manny's voice cut through the wind, sharp and nasty. "Hey, Jules, wake up." Manny was vaping, of course, lost in his phone. To him, Jules was just the old guy. The slow one with the shaky hands who couldn't be trusted with a Porsche. He had no idea, but I saw things. I saw the way Jules looked at the luxury cars, not with envy, but with a strange familiarity. "I'm awake," he mumbled, trying to bring his feet back to life. His shoes were soaked right through. "Big night tonight," Manny sneered, a puff of fake strawberry smoke hitting Jules in the face. "The future of tech gala. All the big shots are here. Don't mess up, old man." I saw Jules recoil, just for a second, and in that moment, I felt that familiar shame. The one that comes from staying quiet when you know you should speak up. I remember he once told me he had a wife, that she liked simple blue dresses. He'd said it so quietly, I almost missed it. Tonight, as the hotel doors opened, spilling light and music onto the freezing pavement, I saw him stare at the guests. He wasn't just looking, he was searching. The smell of good food drifted out, and I knew he hadn't eaten. He was always trying to save a few bucks for rent, for a bill. I saw some of the faces coming out, guys in $1,000 suits. I saw Marcus Sterling, a big-shot lawyer, walk right up to Jules. Sterling didn't even see the man in front of him, just a uniform to hand his ticket to. Jules kept his head down, his cap pulled low to hide his face. He took the keys, got the Mercedes, and got a $2 tip for his trouble. He never said a word. It's a special kind of hell, being invisible. I felt it, but on him, it looked like a physical weight. Heads up, Manny hissed at me, stuffing his vape pen in his pocket. We got a whale. Private driver. Blacked out Escalade. That's the Vance detail. Vance. The name meant nothing to me, but when I looked over at Jules, he'd gone pale. It was like he'd been struck by lightning. He looked like he wanted to bolt, to just vanish into the icy street. But his feet were stuck, like they were frozen right to the sidewalk. I think he was terrified, but also morbidly curious to see what was coming. The SUV was a beast, rumbling up to the curb between two other black cars. It looked less like a vehicle and more like a mobile bank vault. The engine's hum was so low you could feel it in your bones. "Jules, get the door," Manny yelled, already distracted by some woman in a fur coat. I watched Jules move, like he was walking underwater. His hands were shaking so bad, he had to hide them behind his back for a second. He walked up to the back door, and for a moment, I saw his reflection in the dark glass. He looked like a stranger, thin, hollow-eyed, with gray stubble, that made him look 20 years older than he was. He took a breath, reached out, and pulled the heavy handle. The warm air that flowed out smelled like money, like leather and some kind of fancy wood. And the first thing I saw was a single, perfect Italian leather shoe. Then Adrian Vance stepped out. He was impressive, I'll give him that. The guy looked like he was carved from stone, with that sharp haircut and a suit that probably cost more than my car. He moved like he owned the whole city. He didn't even glance at Jules. He just turned back to the Escalade and offered his hand. "Careful, love. It's icy." A woman's hand took his, and I saw Jules stop breathing. From where I stood, I could see his whole body go rigid. He knew that hand. I don't know how, but I knew that he knew it. Then she stepped out, and wow! She was stunning. Not in a flashy way, just pure elegance. It was Emma. Jules had said her name once, in that same quiet voice. Her hair was done up, and she had these simple, beautiful diamonds around her neck. But it was her face that was so different. She looked happy, truly, deeply happy. All the worry lines he'd once described to me were gone. She looked peaceful. "Wait for me?" A little kid's voice came from inside the car. I saw Jules freeze solid. A little boy, maybe 3 years old, scrambled to the door. He was all bundled up in a nice coat and a red scarf. With these big, curious eyes, Adrian just laughed. This deep, happy sound that seemed to echo in the cold air. "We didn't forget you, Leo," he said, his voice full of love. "Come on over, champ." Adrian lifted the boy up like he weighed nothing and settled him on his hip. The kid just giggled and hugged his neck tight. "Did you see the robot, Daddy?" The boy chirped. "The one with lasers?" "I sure did," Adrian said, kissing the top of his head. "But I have a feeling you enjoyed the dessert table more. I like cookies." Leo said, dead serious. And Emma, she just laughed and brushed a snowflake off his nose. You're 100% your father's son, she said. Your father's son. I glanced at Jules. Those words hit him like a punch. I watched the last bit of light go out of his eyes. He was just a hollow shell standing by an open car door. His son. Except he wasn't. I knew Jules couldn't have kids. He'd told me that one night after Manny had been particularly cruel. Said he was a genetic dead end. All his dreams of a legacy gone. And here it was, right in front of him. A happy, healthy little boy being raised by another man. Jules just stood there, paralyzed. I knew he was supposed to be closing the door, fading back into the shadows where he belonged. But he couldn't look away from that kid. Leo had his mother's smile. And then, the boy saw him. Leo's eyes met Jules' suppose. He didn't see a failure, just a man in a funny hat. Hi, Leo said, with a little wave of his mittened hand. That one simple word, it shattered him. I saw the tears well up in Jules' eyes. He tried to say something back, but his throat was too tight. Then Emma turned. She followed her son's gaze, and her eyes landed on the valet. For a second, nothing happened. The snow just kept falling. Then I saw it. The slightest widening of her eyes. She took in the cheap uniform, the wet shoes, the name tag. The name tag I put on his locker myself. Jules. I braced myself, expecting her to laugh, to point him out to her new husband. I almost wanted her to. Anger would have been better than what came next. But she wasn't angry. Her face just softened. It was a look of profound, devastating pity. It was the kind of look you give an injured animal on the side of the road. She didn't say his name. She didn't acknowledge their past. She erased him with her silence. She just turned back to her family. It's freezing out here, Adrian, she said, her voice soft. Let's get Leo inside. He's starting to shiver. Absolutely, he replied. That was it. He was nothing. The man she once loved was now just a valet, a piece of the scenery. And for the first time, my silence didn't feel like cowardice. It felt like a crime. I had let this happen, day after day. Adrian turned to Jules, completely oblivious. To him, this was just another valet at another hotel. Great service, he said, his voice polite and distant. He reached into his coat and pulled out a bill, pressing it into Jules's hand. Stay warm. Jules looked down. It was a crisp, new $100 bill. Thank you, sir, Jules whispered. His voice was broken. As Adrian led his perfect family away, I saw the money slip from Jules's trembling fingers and drift onto the wet pavement. He didn't even notice. I walked over, picked it up, and held it out. He just stared at it. Hey, I said, my own voice shaking a little. Brian, you dropped this. I remember the first time I saw him treat her like she was invisible, right here at this very door. Now, years later, I watched as her new life got into a car to leave. Bye-bye, Leo, the little boy chirped from the new husband's arms. I saw Brian, my coworker, try to wave back, his hand shaking. I saw the woman, Emma, lean her head on her husband's shoulder. They fit together, a complete circle of warmth, and Brian was just the guy holding the door. When it swung shut, the silence on the street felt deafening, and I watched him stare down at the $100 bill in his hand. I knew the old Brian, the one who probably would have used a bill like that to light a cigar or tip a waitress for pouring water. He would have laughed at how little it was. But for this Brian, that flimsy piece of paper was the line between eating and starving, between a warm room and a freezing one. He gripped it until his knuckles were bone white. I saw a sob rack his whole body, a painful tremor he couldn't stop. He just slid down the cold stone wall of the hotel, right onto the damp pavement. I'd watched him for years building that fortress of money, and I'd said nothing. He did it all for an image, for some magazine cover version of a life. He wanted to be a king, but I see it clearly now. Kings are just guys in fancy clothes. Real power is having a hand to hold when everything gets cold. Emma found her hand. Brian was left with nothing. I was about to yell at him from the valet booth, the way I usually do, but seeing him broken like that on the ground, something in me shifted. I saw a man who had been completely erased. I couldn't just shout at him. Not today. I watched him pull himself together, wiping his face on that cheap, rough coat sleeve. He straightened the jacket that was 2 sizes too big and tucked the $100, a pity gift from his replacement, into a pocket next to what I knew was his bus pass. He walked toward the dented sedan pulling up, put on a cracked smile, and ducked his head. "Welcome to the Grand Plaza," I heard him whisper. "How can I help you?" And just like that, the collapse of Brian Thorne was complete. Not with a bang, but with a quiet, frozen whimper. It's a brutal kind of lesson, isn't it? That sometimes the biggest punishment isn't a jail cell, it's an empty life you built yourself. He didn't get some dramatic reckoning. He just got left behind. He threw away something real because he was chasing something shiny, and by the time he realized his mistake, that diamond was gone. It was already sparkling on someone else's hand. I used to think karma meant getting what was coming to you, but now I think it's more about what you lose out on. The real gut punch was seeing he didn't even get anger from her, just pity. For a man like him, that's worse than any fight. I thought about all the times I stood by and did nothing, just another silent witness. But not this time. I walked over, pulling my collar up against the wind. "Brian," I said softly, "I've got this Corolla. Go inside for a minute." It was a small thing, but it was something. I guess you should always be kind to people you meet on the way up. You never know who you'll be standing next to on the way back down. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.